The cold Austin morning air nipped at my thin skin, but it was nothing compared to the chill that had settled in my soul. There, sitting on the curb of the street where I raised my only son, with the hospital bracelet still on my wrist, and a canvas bag containing everything I had left in the world, I stared at the door of my own home. The door I could no longer open. Behind it, lights were turning on, and I could hear the muffled sound of laughter that was not meant for me. It was the laughter of my daughter-in-law, Patricia's parents, the new owners of my home, my refuge, my entire past. Ricardo, my Ricardo, had gifted me to them, like one discards an old piece of furniture. Every brick of that house had been laid with the sweat of my late husband, and with my own life savings from sewing, night after night, so that my boy could have a future. And in that humiliating silence, as the neighbors' cars drove by slowly, their curious glances mixing with pity and judgment, I did not cry. The tears dried up before they were even born. In their place, a cutting clarity, sharp as the best of my needles, took hold of me. I looked at my hands, calloused and wrinkled, and saw the strength they thought they had crushed. They took the roof from over my head, but they forgot that I was the one who built the foundation. And there, at the lowest point of my existence, I did not plan revenge. I planned my resurrection. The taxi ride from the hospital to my home was the longest of my life. A blur of oak trees and mailboxes parading past the window at a sleepy pace, typical of Austin afternoons. Every meter traveled was a step away from the smell of bleach and sickness, and a step closer to the aroma of lavender I always left in sachets in my drawers, to the familiar touch of my old velvet sofa, and above all, to my own silence, my own peace. My hands, thin and spotted with age, clutched the handle of the small canvas bag on my lap, a treasure containing a worn nightgown, a toothbrush, and a paperback romance with yellowed pages. A whole month, a month confined to a bed that was not mine, staring at a ceiling with stains I tried to turn into clouds and animals to keep from going mad. Ricardo visited me only 3 times. Short, hurried visits, his eyes always glued to his cell phone, his body tense as if ready to run at any moment. He said it was work, that Patricia needed him for a social event, that business was demanding every atom of his energy, and I, as always, believed him. Or rather, I chose to believe him. It was easier to swallow the excuse of work than the bitter truth that my presence, even in such a vulnerable state, was a nuisance, an interruption in the perfect life he and his wife had built. I forgave him before he even asked, a mother's habit of refusing to see the cracks in the idealized image of her son. As the taxi turned onto my street, a familiar warmth began to spread through my chest. There was Mrs. Gable's house, with her purple petunias overflowing from the pots, and the Hendersons' house, with the old blue pickup truck always parked crooked in the driveway. And then, there was my house. Small, modest, but it was my universe. The oak tree my late husband planted when Ricardo was born now shaded the entire roof, a silent guardian. I saw my rocking chair on the porch, waiting for me. The longing was a physical ache, an urgency to feel the familiar ground beneath my feet. I couldn't wait to water my ferns, to smell my own coffee, and to sleep in my own bed, under the patchwork quilt I had sewn over decades. Each patch, a memory. Each stitch, a silent prayer. I paid the driver with the crumpled bills I kept in a small envelope, the pension money I managed with almost sacred care. He helped me out, a gesture of kindness from a stranger that contrasted painfully with the absence of my own son. "Have a good day, ma'am," he said, before driving off and leaving me alone in the afternoon silence. I took a deep breath, the Texas air heavy and humid, and walked slowly up the small stone path that led to my door. Every step was an effort, my legs still weak after weeks of inactivity, but my heart was light. I was home. I reached into my purse and took out my keychain, the same one I had used for over 40 years, with a small metal angel Ricardo had given me when he was 7, bought with his first allowance. The cold metal of the key in my hand was comforting. I fitted it into the lock, a motion I had made millions of times, expecting to hear the familiar click that would welcome me. But the click never came. The key wouldn't turn. I frowned, confused. I tried again, pushing a little harder, but it was useless. It was like trying to fit a puzzle piece into the wrong spot. A chill ran down my spine, despite the heat. Maybe the lock was jammed, or maybe, in the rush to get me to the hospital, Ricardo had engaged some extra lock I didn't know about. I looked at the little angel on the keychain, its metallic smile seeming to mock me. Denial was a warm, protective wave. Everything had a logical explanation. I knocked on the door, gently at first. "Ricardo? It's me, Mom." Silence was the only answer. I knocked again, harder, the sound echoing strangely on the quiet street. "Ricardo, Patricia, I'm back." I began to walk along the porch, peering through the living room window. And that's when the world began to tilt. My lace curtains, which my mother had taught me to make, were gone. Their place, heavy, wine-colored silk drapes, blocked the light, and my old oak sideboard, which had belonged to my grandmother, had vanished. In its place stood a modern, mirrored piece of furniture that reflected a distorted image of my terrified face. My heart began to hammer in my chest, a frantic drumbeat announcing disaster. This was no longer my home. I went back to the front door, a cold panic seizing me, and began to pound with both fists, the desperate sound of someone drowning. I was no longer calling, I was pleading. The door finally opened, but it was not my son's face I saw. It was George, Patricia's father, a man with a smile as polished as his expensive shoes, a smile that never reached his cold dealer's eyes. He looked me up and down, his expression a mixture of rehearsed surprise and poorly disguised contempt. "Helena, how good to see you up and about. We didn't know you were being discharged today." His voice was sugary, but each word was a tiny, poisoned needle. Behind him, his wife, Martha, emerged, wearing a pearl necklace that looked like it was worth more than all my furniture. She was drying her hands on a dish towel, as if I had interrupted her in the middle of a chore in her own home. "Dear, you look pale," she said, with a fake concern that turned my stomach. I looked from one to the other, confusion and fear robbing me of words. Where is Ricardo?" I managed to stammer, my voice a trembling thread. George placed a hand on my shoulder, a touch that was meant to be comforting but felt like he was staking a claim. "Ricardo and Patricia are on a little trip. They needed a rest." He paused, savoring the moment, the power he had over me. "They asked us to take care of everything here. In fact, Helena, there's something you should know. To make things easier, to avoid future bureaucracy, Ricardo transferred the house into his name, and, well, he and Patricia decided to give us the property. A gift. Aren't they the dearest?" The word gift floated in the air, surreal and monstrous. My house. A gift. The canvas bag slipped from my hand, falling to the floor with a dull thud. I could feel the eyes of my neighbors. Mrs. Gable had stopped watering her petunias. Mr. Henderson had lowered the hood of his pickup. I was the afternoon spectacle, the old lady being discarded on her own front porch. The soft click of the door closing was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It decreed the end of a chapter, the end of a life. I stood there, motionless on the porch that was no longer mine, staring at the white-painted wood as if I could see through it, as if I could find an explanation, a crumb of logic for what had just happened. But there was nothing, only emptiness. I descended the steps like an automaton, my knees protesting with every movement. I sat on the curb, the same spot where Ricardo used to wait for the school bus, the same spot where I taught him to tie his shoes. The irony was a knife twisted in my chest. Cars drove by, and I didn't care about the stairs. The humiliation was so deep, so complete, that it became a kind of armor. They couldn't hurt me any more than I was already hurt. My son, my only son. He hadn't just taken my roof. He had stolen my memories, erased my past, turned me into a homeless person on the street where everyone knew me as Ricardo's mother. The pain was so overwhelming it transformed into a strange calm, a glacial resignation. This was the end. I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. I was a 72-year-old woman, fresh out of the hospital from pneumonia, with a small pension that barely covered my medication. The afternoon sun beat down on my face, but I didn't feel its warmth. I was frozen inside. I closed my eyes, wishing I could disappear, dissolve into the hot asphalt. It was then that a shadow fell over me, blocking the sun. I opened my eyes and saw a pair of worn shoes and a floral dress. I looked up and met the kind eyes of Lucia, my neighbor from across the street, a woman with whom I had only exchanged nods and comments about the weather. She was holding a glass of water, condensation trickling down her fingers. She said nothing about the scene she had surely witnessed. She just held the glass out to me. "Helena?" Her voice was soft, without a hint of pity, only pure, genuine concern. "Are you all right?" And that simple question, that gesture of compassion from a near stranger, was the first crack in the dam of ice forming around my heart. Little did I know that tiny fissure was where all my strength would begin to pour through. If this story touched your heart, I ask you to join our community of souls who have gone through something similar. If you love Jesus and believe this story will teach us something, subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes of stories of healing and wisdom. Your subscription is an act of faith in your own transformation. The hum of my old Singer sewing machine was the soundtrack of Ricardo's childhood. I remember endless nights after I had tucked him into bed and read him his favorite story, when I would sit in my small wooden chair under the yellowish light of a lamp, and the sound of the needle piercing the fabric would fill the silence of our home. My husband, John, had left us too soon, the victim of a heart that worked too hard and gave out without warning. I was left alone with a 5-year-old boy and a future that felt like a vast, shapeless piece of cloth. Sewing wasn't just my job. It was my anchor, my silent promise to John that our son would have everything he needed. My fingers, now gnarled and spotted with age, were nimble and strong back then. They danced over ball gowns for the wealthy young women in town, mended the uniforms of the local factory workers, and patched the jeans of the neighborhood boys. Every dollar earned was divided into 2 piles, one for bread and milk, the other for the Ricardo Fund. That fund bought his first brand-name sneakers so he wouldn't, feel different from the other boys. It paid for his math tutors so his grades wouldn't stop him from dreaming. And eventually, it funded the deposit for his first apartment, when he decided it was time to have his own space. I wore the same 3 frayed dresses for years, mending them with a skill that hid their age, and my meals were often whatever was left on his plate. I didn't see it as a sacrifice. I saw it as an investment of love. I was building his future with every stitch, every hem, every zipper I sewed. I imagined that every piece of clothing that left my hands carried a piece of my hope, and that, somehow, the universe would repay it, ensuring my son would grow up to be a good, grateful, and loving man. I saw him as my masterpiece, a fine, strong fabric I was weaving with the thread of my own life. Ricardo met Patricia during his last year at community college. He brought her home for Sunday dinner, and I spent 2 days preparing everything. I roasted the tau, chicken I knew he loved, baked my apple pie, and even bought a new tablecloth. When I saw her for the first time, standing in my doorway, I was struck. She was tall, elegant, with perfectly styled hair and an air of confidence I had never possessed. She carried a handbag that probably cost more than my sewing machine and handed me a bottle of wine with a French name I couldn't pronounce. In that moment, a pang of hope and fear mixed in my chest. Hope that she would make my son happy, that she would propel him to the success I had always dreamed of for him. And fear, a subtle, creeping fear, that she would take him into a world where I didn't belong. During dinner, I did my best to be welcoming. I asked about her family, her studies, her dreams. Her answers were polite but brief. Her eyes scanned my living room, lingering for a moment too long on my old furniture, my small collection of porcelain trinkets, the slightly faded wallpaper. I saw a silent judgment in her gaze, an assessment, that classified me as quaint, or more likely, outdated. Ricardo, who was usually so talkative at home, seemed nervous, laughing too loudly at her unfunny jokes and avoiding my gaze. He looked like an actor in a play, desperate for the approval of his one-person audience. When I offered Patricia a slice of my pie, she smiled a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Oh, no thank you, Helena. I'm counting calories." It was the first of many refusals, the first of many invisible barriers. She erected between us. That night, after they left, I felt a chill. The expensive scent of her perfume still hung in the air, a strange and invasive aroma in my simple home. I realized I wasn't just gaining a daughter-in-law. I was losing a piece of my son to a world that valued outer gloss far more than inner warmth. The first time I felt truly humiliated by them was during the first barbecue they hosted at their new house. A 2-story home in a gated community with a lawn so perfect it looked like plastic. I was excited by the invitation, seeing it as a chance to connect with their new life. I spent the entire morning making my famous potato salad and a tray of brownies, the recipes that were always a hit at our family gatherings. When I arrived, the house was full of beautiful, well-dressed people, all holding wine glasses and talking about the stock market and trips to Europe. I felt immediately out of place in my floral dress and comfortable sandals. Patricia greeted me at the EGI door with a kiss in the air, near my cheek. "Helena, so glad you could make it," she said with forced enthusiasm. She took the platters from my hand. "Let me just put these away for you in the kitchen." I followed her, hoping to help, but she quickly placed them on a bottom shelf in the refrigerator, behind boxes of smoked salmon and imported cheeses. My salad and my brownies never saw the light of day. Later, I saw a catering company serving canapés and desserts that looked like tiny works of art. I stood near the grill where Ricardo was busy, trying to make conversation with him, but he was always being pulled in another direction by one of his new important friends. At one point, I overheard one of Patricia's friends, a slim blonde woman, ask her, gesturing discreetly in my direction, "Pat, who's that older lady by the grill?" And Patricia's answer was a stab to my heart. "Oh, that's just Ricardo's mom," she said, with a tone of voice that made it a footnote, a social obligation. Then she leaned in and whispered something I couldn't hear, and they both laughed. I was a burden, an embarrassing piece of old furniture that didn't match the new, modern decor of their lives. I stood there, holding a plastic cup of water, and for the first time, I felt both invisible and, at the same time, far too exposed. It didn't take long for the burden I represented to become not just social, but financial, though in a reverse way. The exploitation began subtly, almost innocently. Ricardo called me one day, his voice a mix of panic and opportunity. He needed $5,000 for a down payment on a new car. His, according to him, was on its last legs, and he couldn't risk losing important sales. "It's just for a few months, Mom. As soon as I close that big deal, I'll pay you back every cent. With interest," he promised, his voice laden with the sincerity he knew would melt me. I went to the bank that very afternoon and withdrew a considerable portion of the savings I had put away for my own old age, the money that was supposed to be my safety net for medical emergencies. I felt good helping him. I felt needed, a part of his life, of his successes. But the months passed, and the money was never mentioned again. 6 months later, it was Patricia who called. Her voice was sweet as honey. They wanted to do a small kitchen remodel, an investment opportunity that would increase the value of the house. The contractor required a payment up front, and they were a little tight that month. It was only $3,000. Once again, I gave in. The pattern was set. There was always a crisis, an unmissable opportunity, an unexpected bill, a trip for networking in the Caribbean, a cosmetic surgery for Patricia that insurance didn't cover, credit card debts that needed to be paid off urgently. Each request came wrapped in promises and declarations of love. And each time, my bank account shrank, while the shame and fear grew inside me. I told no one. How could I admit that my own son, the boy I gave everything to, was bleeding me dry? I felt complicit in my own ruin, trapped between a mother's unconditional love and the terrible awareness that I was being used in a cruel and systematic way. The humiliation culminated unforgettably at a Thanksgiving dinner. They invited me by phone the day before, almost as an afterthought. "Of course we want you here, Mom," Ricardo said, after a long pause that suggested the idea hadn't been his. I arrived on time, carrying a pumpkin pie I had baked myself, the smell of cinnamon and nutmeg filling my small car. Their house was beautifully decorated, a scene out of a magazine, with candles and flower arrangements everywhere. Patricia's parents, George and Martha, were already there, as were a few other couples, all laughing and drinking cocktails. Patricia greeted me with her icy hostess smile and took the pie. "Thank you, Helena. I'll put it with the other desserts." I was led into the living room, where I tried to mingle, but the conversations were about subjects I didn't understand. No one asked me any questions. I was a silent figure in the corner of the room. When it was time to sit for dinner, Patricia began assigning seats. "George, you sit at the head. Martha, next to me." She went around the long mahogany table, and my heart sank with each name that was called that wasn't mine. When everyone was seated, only one empty place remained at the main table. But Patricia turned to me with an expression of fake distress. "Helena, my goodness. I completely mixed up the seating. Would you mind using that little corner table? That way you'll be more comfortable, with more space." The little corner table was a small bistro table, barely big enough for a plate and a glass, placed near the kitchen door, far from the warmth and conversation of the main table. I was an extra mouth, literally separated from the family. Ricardo was at the other end of the table, carving the turkey, and he shot me a quick glance, a mix of guilt and helplessness before focusing on his task again. I ate my Thanksgiving dinner alone, the sound of silverware and laughter from the other table echoing in my ears. Every bite tasted like ash. At that moment, I was no longer the host's mother. I was a nuisance, a stranger they were obliged to feed out of politeness. The isolation of that Thanksgiving dinner became a reflection of my daily life. Ricardo's phone calls, which had once been daily, became weekly, then monthly, and finally ceased almost entirely. It was I who had to call, and when I did, his voice was always distant, rushed. "Mom, I can't talk right now. I'm in the middle of a meeting. I'll call you later." The later never came. If I persisted, it was Patricia's cold, cutting voice that would answer. "Helena, he's extremely busy. His job is very stressful. You wouldn't understand. Please only call if it's a real emergency." My loneliness, my desire to hear my son's voice, apparently didn't qualify as an emergency. The days became long and silent, marked only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. The television became my only companion, its canned voices and laughter a faint imitation of a full house. The pain of rejection began to manifest physically. The arthritis in my hands worsened, turning sewing, my old passion, into a painful task. I started to feel a constant pressure in my chest, a shortness of breath that doctors said was anxiety. I knew it was the weight of abandonment. The walls of my house, once my refuge, began to feel like a prison. Every object held a memory of a happier time, a reminder of a Ricardo who smiled at me, who hugged me, who called me the best mom in the world. Now, those memories were like ghosts that haunted me, mocking my naivety. I was withering away, not from a lack of food or shelter, but from a lack of love, of purpose, of connection. I was becoming an empty shell, and it was in this state of physical and emotional fragility that pneumonia found me, a predator that attacks the weakest of the herd. The illness that sent me to the hospital was merely the visible symptom of a much deeper, older sickness that had already taken hold of my soul. A few weeks before I fell ill, Ricardo showed up at my door unannounced, which was rare. He didn't come empty-handed. He brought a bouquet of lilies, my favorite flowers. His smile was wide, his hugs were warm, and for a moment, foolish hope bloomed in my chest. Maybe he had missed me. Maybe he wanted to reconnect. We sat in the kitchen, and he told me about his work, complimented my house, reminisced about childhood stories. He was setting me up for the blow with the skill of a master manipulator. Then, in a low, serious voice, he began to talk about the future. He used complicated words like estate planning, probate, and government bureaucracy. He painted a grim picture of how, after my death, the house would be stuck in legal limbo for years, costing a fortune in fees and lawyers. "It's a nightmare, Mom," he said, holding my hand. "I don't want the place that Dad and you built with so much love to be eaten up by taxes." Then he presented the solution. If I signed the house over to him now, it would just be a formality on paper. I would continue to live in it. Nothing would change. It would just be a way to protect my legacy and ensure everything went smoothly. "It's for your own good, to spare me more. Grief when you're gone," he concluded, his eyes filled with fake concern. A small voice of alarm went off in the back of my mind, an instinct whispering that something was wrong. But I silenced it. I was so desperate for his affection, so starved for a sign that he cared, that I accepted his twisted logic. Believing him was easier than facing the terrible truth that he was lying to me. That day, I agreed to sign the papers. I traded the security of my only property, my only material asset in the world, for a bouquet of flowers and a few hours of feigned attention. It was the most expensive deal of my life. My hospital stay was a desert of white, sterile time. I spent 31 days lying in a creaky bed, staring at a stained ceiling, and listening to the constant beeping of monitors. The outside world seemed to have disappeared. The nurses, with their rushed but kind efficiency, became my only source of regular human contact. They called me honey, adjusted my pillows, and told me about their children. I watched, with silent envy, the families that gathered around other beds. Sons who read the newspaper aloud to their fathers, daughters who brought homemade soup in thermoses, grandchildren who drew colorful pictures and taped them to the wall. They filled the rooms with conversation, laughter, and the simple, comforting presence of love. My room, in contrast, remained silent. Ricardo visited 3 times, each visit less than 15 minutes. He would stand near the door, as if afraid of catching my illness, or perhaps my old age. He talked about work, the traffic, the weather. He never asked how I was really feeling. He never held my hand. His eyes were always somewhere else. Patricia never came. She didn't even call. When the head nurse, a kind woman named Brenda, asked about my family, I lied. "Oh, my son is a very important man, you see, and my daughter-in-law travels a lot for work. They worry, but they're just so busy." Brenda just smiled a sad smile and squeezed my arm. She knew. She saw the truth every day. In the loneliness of those long nights, when coughing kept me awake, the illusion I had so carefully built began to disintegrate. The excuse of work was no longer enough to cover the chasm of neglect. I was alone, completely and irrevocably alone, and the realization that the person I loved most in the world could simply leave me to waste away in a hospital without a shred of remorse was a pain far sharper than the pneumonia burning in my lungs. Now, in Lucia's cozy kitchen, the smell of cinnamon from the tea she prepared seemed to anchor me back to reality. Sitting at her wooden table, the warmth of the mug heating my trembling hands, I finally let the dam break. The tears I refused to shed on the curb now flowed freely, sobs racking my frail body, releasing years of pent-up pain, of swallowed humiliations, and of a crushing loneliness. Lucia said nothing. She just sat across from me, pushing the box of tissues in my direction, her presence a silent rock in my storm. She gave me the gift of her time and her silence, allowing me to empty my heart without judgment. When the tears finally subsided, I began to speak. The words came tumbling out, a confused torrent of painful memories. The unserved pie, the Thanksgiving dinner, the requests for money, the lie about the house. For the first time, I was telling my story, and the simple act of verbalizing the betrayal made it real, undeniable. Lucia listened patiently, her dark eyes filled with an understanding that went beyond pity. When I finished, she reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "Helena," she said, her voice firm, "they did a terrible thing, but you are not what they did to you. You are stronger than you think." It was then that she told me about the Community Legal Aid Center, a place that offered help to people like me, people who couldn't afford an expensive lawyer. "You have rights," she repeated, the phrase echoing in my mind. "That house was yours. You can't just let them take what is yours by right." Her words were like a lit match in a dark room. For the first time since I left the hospital, I felt a spark, not of hope, but of something more primal, a fighting instinct, a desire to reclaim not the house, but my dignity. Motivated by Lucia's words, I began to rummage through the small bag that held the wreckage of my old life. I was looking for anything, any piece of paper that could prove my story. And there, at the bottom of my wallet's zippered compartment, folded into a small square, I found it. It was a receipt from the notary's office, with a date that chilled me to the bone. It was issued the day after the visit when Ricardo convinced me to sign the papers. He had wasted no time. His haste to dispossess me of my home was cold, brutal proof of his premeditation. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the paper. But that wasn't all. Tucked behind the receipt, like a carbon copy ghost, was a small bank deposit slip I didn't even remember keeping. The date was only 1 week after the property transfer. The depositor was George Miller, Patricia's father. The amount was $150,000. The air left my lungs in a painful hiss. Lucia's jaw dropped as she looked over my shoulder. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't to avoid bureaucracy. It was a sordid business transaction. My son sold my house behind my back, sold the walls that I watched him grow, the garden where he took his first steps, the roof that sheltered him. He sold me. He liquidated me like an unwanted asset, took the money, and left me to die in a hospital. The pain of the betrayal was so intense it transformed into a cold, crystalline anger. The grief for the loss of the son I thought I had gave way to an ironclad determination. That small piece of paper in my hands wasn't just proof of a financial crime. It was proof of my sanity. It was the key to my liberation. And in that envelope of lies was a truth that would change absolutely everything. The night in Lucia's house, after the discovery of the deposit, was the quietest of my life. The initial shock gave way not to a fit of rage or a sea of tears, as I might have expected, but to a deep glacial calm. It was the calm that follows a devastating storm, when everything that could be broken has been destroyed, and what remains is the bare landscape and the raw truth. I sat in Lucia's armchair, the carbon copy slip resting on my lap, and I felt a seismic shift occur within me. The Helena who forgave, who made excuses, who loved blindly, died in that kitchen. She was gone, along with the image of the boy she raised, an image I now understood had been a mirage for years. In her place, a woman I didn't know began to rise from the ashes. She was made of a harder substance. Her emotions were not a whirlwind, but a river of ice, slow-moving and powerful. I looked at my hands, and for the first time, I didn't just see the marks of work and old age. I saw the hands of a survivor. The humiliation I felt on the curb didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It was no longer a suffocating cloak of shame. It became a rocky ground beneath my feet, a firm place from which I could begin to climb. There was no more room for denial. Ricardo's betrayal wasn't a mistake, a moment of weakness. It was a series of deliberate, calculated, and cruel choices. He had appraised me, priced me, and sold me. And accepting that truth, as brutal as it was liberating. I no longer needed his love to validate my existence. My worth was not tied to his approval. For the first time in decades, maybe my entire life, my focus turned inward. What did I want? What did I need? The answer came clear and simple: justice. Not the revenge that destroys, but the justice that rebuilds. The justice of having the truth acknowledged. I turned to Lucia, who was watching me with a silent wisdom, and said, in a voice I barely recognized as my own, "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to that legal aid center." There was no hesitation, no doubt. It was the sound of a decision forged in fire. The legal aid center was in an old downtown building, with worn linoleum floors and the smell of old paper and strong coffee. It was filled with people whose faces told stories of struggle, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone in my despair. I was introduced to David, a young lawyer with a slightly rumpled suit, thick-rimmed glasses, and eyes that conveyed a seriousness and compassion far beyond his years. I sat across from his metal desk, piled high with case files, and told my story. To speak of the most intimate details of my pain to a stranger was like ripping a bandage off a wound that had not yet healed. My voice failed several times, and the shame of exposing how my own son had deceived me was a bitter taste in my mouth. But David didn't interrupt. He just listened, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, his gaze never wavering. When I finished, he looked at the papers I had brought, the notary receipt and the deposit slip, and a glint of righteous indignation appeared in his eyes. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, his tone professional yet comforting, "what they did isn't just morally reprehensible, it's fraud. We have a very strong case here." His validation was like a balm. He explained the process, the letters that would be sent, the possibility of a settlement, the chance of going to court. He was honest about the difficulties. It would be a stressful and lengthy process. And he was right. The first letter from Ricardo's lawyer arrived a week later. It was a cold, brutal document that accused me of mental instability and ingratitude. It claimed the money from George Miller was a personal loan to Ricardo and had nothing to do with the house, that the transfer of the property was an act of love and protection that I, in my senile state, was now maliciously distorting. Every word was a stab, an attempt to discredit me, to paint me as a crazy, greedy old woman. Patricia and Ricardo weren't just fighting me legally. They were trying to annihilate my credibility and my sanity. The battle that followed was fought on two fronts, one in the quiet corridors of law offices, and another, much louder one, on the streets of my own neighborhood. The lies Ricardo's lawyer wrote in the official letter soon spread through the community, whispered over garden, fences, and in grocery store lines. Ricardo and Patricia, in their rare appearances, adopted the posture of tragic victims, speaking in sorrowful voices about my sad condition. Some neighbors, those with whom I had only a superficial relationship, began to avoid me. Their looks of pity were almost as painful as looks of contempt. They saw me as the embodiment of their worst fear, lonely, confused old age. The nights became my personal battlefield. Sleep eluded me, and I would lie in Lucia's guest bed, replaying memories. I would see Ricardo's face as a child, his eyes full of trust and love, and I would desperately try to find the exact point where that boy got lost. Guilt haunted me. Where did I go wrong? Did I love too much? Was I too blind? The pain was a physical weight, a constant pressure on my chest that left me breathless. But amid this darkness, small lights began to appear. Lucia was my rock, never allowing me to falter. And slowly, others joined her. Mrs. Gable, the neighbor with the purple petunias, showed up one day with a pot of hot stew, saying, "I know what it's like to be mistreated by the ones you love. Don't you believe a word they say." Mr. Henderson, of the blue pickup truck, offered to drive me to my appointments with the lawyer. Other women I barely knew shared their own stories of betrayal and resilience. I discovered that my pain, though unique to me, was part of a larger tapestry of female suffering and survival. They became my new family, a support network woven not with ties of blood, but with threads of empathy and mutual respect. Their faith in me strengthened my own, giving me the courage to keep fighting, not just for myself, but for all of them. The day of the settlement hearing arrived on a gray autumn morning. The mediator's office was an impersonal place, with beige walls and generic furniture, designed to have no personality, to be neutral ground. I felt small and insignificant in that environment. But David, my young lawyer, placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder before we went in. "Remember, Helena, the truth is on your side." And I clung to that sentence like a talisman. They were already there, sitting on the other side of a long conference table. Ricardo, Patricia, and a lawyer, who looked like he had stepped out of a magazine ad, with a flawless suit and an arrogant smirk. Patricia was dressed as if for a party, with sparkling jewelry and heavy makeup that couldn't hide the hostility in her eyes. She glared at me, a viper ready to strike. Ricardo was the picture of misery. He was pale, with dark circles under his eyes, and he didn't dare meet my gaze. He kept his eyes fixed on an empty spot on the wall, as if trying to dissociate himself from the room, the situation, me. Their lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth and venomous, weaving a narrative where I was the villain, a manipulative, mentally unstable mother trying to punish her devoted son for finding happiness. He spoke of all the sacrifices Ricardo and Patricia had made for me, all the concerns they had for my health. I listened to the stream of lies without blinking, my face a mask of serenity. My silence seemed to unnerve them more than any tears or shouting would have. Patricia shifted in her chair, impatient. Their lawyer began to stammer, losing his rhythm. And Ricardo, he seemed to shrink with every word, as if the weight of his own lies was finally crushing him. The mediator, a middle-aged man with a weary face, finally turned to me. "Mrs. Rodriguez, we'd like to hear your side of the story." David opened his briefcase, ready to launch the legal offensive, to present the evidence, the documents, the cold logic of the law. But I stopped him with a gentle gesture. I placed my wrinkled hand on his and shook my head slowly. "I'll do this myself," I whispered. He looked at me, surprised, but he saw the unshakable determination in my eyes and stood down. I took a deep breath, not to find courage, but to calm the furious beating of my heart. I ignored the lawyers, the mediator, and even Patricia. My eyes found Ricardo's, and I held them, forcing him to finally see me. My voice, when it came, was not one of anger. It was the voice of a pain so deep it had become almost tranquil. "I'm not going to talk about the house, Ricardo," I began, each word carefully chosen. "Houses can be rebuilt, but some things cannot." I began to paint pictures with words, memories that only the two of us shared. "You remember when you were 6 and you desperately wanted a Superman costume for Halloween, but the store was sold out? I stayed up for 2 straight nights with scraps of blue and red fabric, sewing that cape and that emblem for you. I remember your face when you saw it. You said it was magic." I continued, my voice gaining strength. "I remember the day you fell off your bike and scraped your knee. You cried so hard, thinking you'd never be able to ride again. I kissed the scrape and told you the pain would pass, that you were stronger than any fall, and you believed me." My voice broke, tears finally welling in my eyes. "At your father's funeral, you held my hand so tightly. You were 19, but you looked like a little boy again. You looked me in the eyes and promised, 'I will take care of you forever, Mom. I promise.'" I paused, letting the weight of that broken promise fill the silence in the room. Then, I asked the question that burned in my soul. "Ricardo, my son, I don't want the money. I just want to understand. At what point did my love become such a heavy burden? When did I become less important than a new car, than a remodeled kitchen, than her approval? At what point did you forget who you were?" The impact of my words in the room was immediate and seismic. It was as if I had switched on a light in a dark room, revealing the filthy truth everyone was trying to ignore. Patricia opened her mouth to protest, her face a mask of fury. "This is ridiculous. She's trying to manipulate him," she hissed. But before she could continue, Ricardo raised a hand, a weak gesture to silence her. His face, once pale and tense, completely crumbled. The dam he had built to contain his guilt broke, and he began to sob. These were not quiet, restrained sobs, but the loud, anguished sobs of a lost little boy, the kind of crying that comes from the depths of the soul. He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking. The words came out jumbled between tears, a chaotic and desperate confession. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. Patricia, she said you were an obstacle, that your house was a dead asset. She made me feel ashamed of you, of our life. I was so afraid of losing her. I'm weak. I'm a coward. Forgive me." Every word was a stab for Patricia, who stared at him with a mixture of shock and disgust. For me, however, there was no triumph in his confession. There was only an infinite sadness. The son I loved was not a monster, but something perhaps worse, a weak man who had traded his soul for a life of appearances. The victory wasn't watching him break. The real victory was the moment I realized my peace no longer depended on his repentance. The mediator, clearly shaken, cleared his throat and suggested a break. Ricardo's lawyer, seeing his case disintegrate, quickly agreed to a full settlement. They would pay the market value of the house, plus compensation for emotional distress. Ricardo, still sobbing, nodded his assent to everything. It seemed the battle was over. But I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. David looked at me, confused. All eyes turned to me. I looked at my son, a broken figure across the table, and then at the mediator. My voice was calm, but it resonated with a newfound authority. "That is not enough," I said. "I have one more condition." The silence in the mediation room was so thick, it seemed to have weight and shape. Everyone stared at me, expecting a financial demand, a complex legal clause. Patricia had a look of contempt in her eyes, as if to say, "Here it comes. The greedy old woman is going to ask for more." Ricardo just looked at me, his face stained with tears, the expression of a man resigned to his punishment. My voice, when I spoke, was devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of pure and simple consequence. The settlement money is what the law dictates. It's the price of the house you stole from me. My condition has nothing to do with money. I paused, letting the weight of my next statement settle before it was even spoken. I looked directly at Ricardo. "I want you, personally, to go to that house. I want you to go down to the basement, where I know Patricia had my things thrown, and I want you to pack every single box. I want you to touch every photograph, every piece of fabric, every book I ever read. I want you to feel the weight of the life you tried to erase." I continued, my voice firm as steel. "Then, I want you to bring those boxes to me yourself. And finally, I want you to sit down with George and Martha, look them in the eyes, and explain why they need to vacate my house. I don't want a lawyer to do it. I want them to hear the truth of your betrayal from your mouth." Patricia's lawyer began to protest, calling the demand unusual and humiliating. But the mediator silenced him with a look. Patricia was livid, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, shocked that I had dared to demand something other than money. But Ricardo, to my surprise, just nodded slowly, tears streaming silently down his face. It was the first time in years he had accepted responsibility without an excuse. He understood. I wasn't asking him to return my belongings. I was demanding that he face the enormity of what he had done, not with a check, but with his own 2 hands. I was forcing him to unearth the mother he had tried to bury alive. The settlement hearing didn't just destroy Ricardo's facade, it imploded the foundation of his marriage. The news of what happened in that room spread like wildfire, as these things always do in small communities. Lucia told me what she heard, not with gossipy pleasure, but with the solidarity of someone who understands the dynamics of power and shame. Patricia couldn't stand the humiliation. For her, Ricardo's greatest sin was not his cruelty to his mother, but the weakness of having been exposed. A man who cries, who confesses, who falls apart in public, did not fit the image of success and power she had worked so hard to project. Her world was built on the appearance of strength, and Ricardo's capitulation was a betrayal of that pact. They said their fight that night could be heard all over the neighborhood. Shouts, objects breaking, venomous accusations. She called him a failure, a mama's boy, a disgrace. 2 weeks later, a moving truck pulled up to the house that was once mine, but it wasn't there for George and Martha's furniture. It was there for Patricia's belongings. She left him. She took the expensive car, the jewelry, the joint bank accounts she had managed to empty. She left behind a broken man, an empty house full of echoes, and the scorn of a community that now knew the truth. I felt no joy in hearing this. I felt a deep, sad emptiness. Their empire, which had seemed so solid and shiny, was just a hollow shell, and it took only a breath of truth for it all to turn to dust. They weren't destroyed by a revenge plot of mine. They were consumed by their own rot. The consequence of their actions was not a punishment I imposed, but the natural, inevitable result of a life built on lies and cruelty. About a month later, a visibly thinner and older Ricardo knocked on Lucia's door. He didn't arrive in his luxury car, but in a rented pickup truck, grimy with dust. The arrogance was gone from his posture. He was now stooped under the weight of a weariness that seemed to come from his soul. He had kept his promise. He unloaded. One by one, more than a dozen cardboard boxes, all marked in his hesitant handwriting, Mom's things. He stacked them on Lucia's porch, and each box he set down seemed to tear a piece out of him. When he finished, he turned to me, his eyes red and swollen. He held out a keychain, my keychain, with the little metal angel. The house is empty. Her parents are gone. I cleaned everything. It's yours again, Mom. Please, come home. The smell of mothballs and dust emanated from the boxes, this scent of my boxed-up past. I looked at the keys in his trembling hand, the little metal angel staring back at me. For a moment I felt the temptation, the familiar pull of that place. But then I looked at my son's face, and at the boxes, and I saw the scene for what it was, an attempt to turn back time, to erase what had been done. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was impossible. I took the keys from his hand, my fingers brushing against his, and then I placed them back in his palm and closed his fingers around them. I can't, Ricardo, I said, my voice soft but unshakable. That house is tainted. Every room holds the memory of my humiliation. Every window looks out on the street where I was exposed. A home is a place of safety, and I would never feel safe there again. You can have the house, sell it, do what you want, but it is no longer my home. Seeing the understanding and the finality of the pain in his eyes was the goodbye we never had. In that moment, I wasn't just refusing a piece of property. I was freeing myself from the last chain that bound me to a life of pain. I was choosing myself. The money from the legal settlement, when it finally arrived, felt foreign in my bank account. It was a number with many zeros, a number that represented the sum total of my suffering. Lucia and my new friends helped me not to feel overwhelmed by it. They took me to see apartments in a quiet neighborhood, near a park and a library. I found a place on the second floor of a small building with a large living room window that flooded the space with morning light and a balcony big enough for 3 pots of geraniums. It was less than half the size of my old house, but it felt infinitely larger in possibility. The first few days were a mixture of joy and strangeness. The smell of fresh paint was the scent of a new beginning. Unpacking my boxes was a bittersweet ritual. I cried when I rediscovered my wedding photos and Ricardo's first drawings. But instead of putting them away as relics of a painful past, I placed them in new frames, integrating them into my new life, not as anchors, but as reminders of how far I had come. I bought simple new furniture, a comfortable armchair for reading, a kitchen table where I could have my friends over for coffee. And most importantly, I bought the best sewing machine money could buy. Sitting down in front of it for the first time, feeling the smooth motor under my control, was like finding a lost part of myself. In that small apartment, surrounded by sunlight and the hum of my new machine, I wasn't just building a new place to live. I was, stitch by stitch, sewing my soul back together. The tranquility of my new apartment was healing, but after a few weeks, the quiet began to feel like the old loneliness. I had my friends, but I needed a purpose, something to fill the long days. The idea came during a coffee with Lucia. I had a skill I had spent a lifetime honing. I had the knowledge of a craftswoman and the heart of a teacher. And, for the first time in my life, I had the resources to turn that idea into a reality. After weeks of research and planning, with David helping me with the paperwork and Lucia helping me scout locations, I found it. It was a small, abandoned storefront with a dusty display window, just a few blocks from the community center. The rent was reasonable, and the space, though it needed a lot of work, had potential. I used a portion of the settlement money to secure the first year's lease and to buy the basics. I threw myself into the project with an energy I hadn't felt in years. I painted the walls a cheerful yellow, sanded the wooden floors until they shone again, and scoured secondhand shops for sturdy work tables and chairs. I bought 5 more used but robust sewing machines and cleaned and oiled them until they ran perfectly. Finally, I hand-painted a simple wooden sign, the letters a little crooked but full of pride. Helena's Sewing Workshop. It wasn't a business designed to make me rich. It was a refuge, a place where hands could be busy while hearts healed, a place to create, not just clothing, but community, a place that I hoped would become a home for others, just as it was becoming for me. At first, business at the workshop was slow. An elderly lady came in to ask me to fix the zipper on her jacket. A young mother asked how much I would charge to hem her son's uniform pants. I did every small job with meticulous care and charged fair prices. Slowly, the word spread. But the real change happened when I started offering classes. On Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, I taught the fundamentals of sewing. My first students were a motley crew. There was Maria, a recent immigrant who wanted to learn a trade to help support her family. There was Mrs. Gable, my old neighbor, who decided she wanted a hobby to occupy her lonely afternoons. And there was Chloe, a quiet teenager who was bullied at school and found a way to express her identity by creating her own clothes. The sound that soon filled the workshop wasn't just the hum of sewing machines. It was the sound of conversation, of laughter, of women sharing their stories, their fears, and their triumphs. They talked about difficult children, absent husbands, financial troubles, and deferred dreams. The workshop became a sanctuary, a safe place where the fabric we cut and sewed was a metaphor for the lives we were trying to mend and redesign. I was no longer just a seamstress. I was a confidant, a mentor, a grandmother to the teenager who didn't have one, a mother to the young woman who was far from home. They called me Miss Helena, and with every stitch I taught, every piece of advice I gave, I felt the hole in my own heart filling, not with the lost love of a son, but with the abundant, reciprocal love of a family I had chosen and built myself. One evening, I stayed late at the workshop, finishing a baptismal gown for one of my students' granddaughters. The street outside was quiet, and the only light came from my lamp, illuminating the white satin fabric under the needle. I paused for a moment and looked around. The yellow walls were now covered with fabric swatches, measurement charts, and photos of my students with their creations. Mannequins displayed the works in progress, like silent sentinels of a labor of love. The room smelled of new cloth, machine oil, and coffee. The soft hum of my machine was a melody of peace and, productivity. An overwhelming feeling of contentment washed over me. This was my wealth. It wasn't in a house deed or a bank account. It was in the purpose I felt in my hands, in the community that flourished within these 4 walls, in the dignity of building something beautiful and useful from nothing. The house I had lived in for 40 years, the house I thought was the definition of home, was just a building. It held memories, yes, but it also held the pain of neglect and the ghost of betrayal. True home, I realized, is not a place where you live. It's a place where you are seen, where you are valued, where your presence matters. And here, in this little workshop, surrounded by thread and fabric, I was seen, I was valued, I mattered. I had built, with my own calloused hands, not just a business, but a refuge. I was finally home. I was locking the workshop door, the bell jingling softly with the movement, when I saw him. Across the street, partially hidden in the shadows of an awning, was Ricardo. It wasn't the first time. For the past few months, he would appear now and then, always from a distance, always in silence. He looked like a specter, a faded version of the confident man he once was. He didn't approach, didn't try to speak. He just watched. I didn't know if it was out of remorse, curiosity, or some twisted form of penance. At first, his presence unsettled me, an unwelcome reminder of the past. But that night, seeing him there, so lost and alone, I felt no anger, I felt no pity. I felt almost nothing. He was like an old photograph of someone I used to know. The emotional connection, the rope that had bound me to him with love and pain, had finally been severed. He no longer had power over my peace. I didn't need his forgiveness to feel whole, nor his suffering to feel vindicated. My life was here, on this side of the street, in the light of my workshop, full of purpose and people who respected me. His life was over there, in the shadows he had created for himself. I used to think the greatest pain was a son abandoning his mother. Today, I know the greatest freedom is a mother, finally, freeing herself from the pain of a son. Today, I do not have the luxury they so desperately sought, but I have respect. And that, no one can ever take from me again. 2 years passed, like the smooth glide of fabric under the machine's needle. Helena's sewing workshop was no longer just a name on a wooden sign, but had become the beating heart of a small part of the city. The space, once empty and silent, now buzzed with the constant hum of a dozen machines, with the sound of scissors cutting through patterns, and most importantly, with the voices and laughter of my new family. My students became my daughters and granddaughters of the heart, and together we turned the workshop into a small cooperative. We now produce dresses for local boutiques, mend the uniforms for the neighborhood baseball team, and once a month, we make quilts to donate to the women's shelter. At 74, I feel more alive than I did at 50. The arthritis still complains on cold mornings, but my hands have found a purpose that transcends it. It was on one of those busy afternoons, as I was helping young Chloe draft a pattern for her prom dress, that the bell on the door chimed, and a sudden silence fell over the room. Standing in the doorway, hesitant, as if needing permission to breathe the air in that place, was Ricardo. He was different. The expensive suit had been replaced by simple jeans and a cotton shirt. There were a few silver threads at his temples, and the worry lines on his face seemed to have deepened, but his eyes, for the first time in a long time, were clear and direct. He was holding a small pot with a single white orchid. He walked slowly toward me, his gaze taking in the women who watched him with protective suspicion. He stopped in front of me and held out the flower. "I know I can't fix what I broke," he said, his voice low and hoarse, "but I want to learn how to build something." He didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't make excuses. He looked at the sewing machines and said, I'd like to know if you have an opening in your beginner's class." The request hung in the air, so unexpected and humble that it disarmed all of us. I looked at my son, this man whom life had unstitched and who was now trying to sew himself back together, and I saw neither the boy I had idolized nor the monster who had betrayed me. I saw just a man, seeking a second chance, not with me, but with himself. A small smile formed on my lips, a smile not of forgiveness, but of peace. I saw myself in him, in the desire to start over. It took me a long time to recognize myself in the mirror, but today, finally, I see the woman I have become.